Now that we've built our to-do list app with table views, permanent data storage, and advanced keyboard control, there's one big topic left to cover in this section, and that is downloading web content. This is really the beginning of making serious apps because it enables you to connect your apps to the web, downloading any information you need, and connecting to powerful services like Google Maps or Facebook. We'll also get to use something called the queue and get a taste of multi-threaded programming. So let's get started. We're going to start with a new project as usual. I'm going to go back to the good old single view application, and we'll call this downloading web content. I'll pop it as usual on the desktop. And we'll start with the most straightforward way of displaying web content, and that is using something called a web view, which essentially allows us to display a small browser window within our app. So if we look for it down here in the object library, there it is, web view. So I'm going to bring that in and we'll make it full screen. I'm not going to worry about different screen sizes or anything this time. I'm going to go straight to bringing up my assistant, which I'll use to display viewcontroller.swift. And then we'll create an outlet as usual for our web view. So control drag just under where the view controller class is defined, and I'll call it web view. There we go, and everything else we can do just in viewcontroller.swift. So all we need to do with our web view is define a URL that we want to display in it, and then instruct our iPhone to load that URL. So we do that by defining a variable that I'll call URL. I'm using let because this variable is not going to change. And we actually create it not as a string, but as a URL. So we use the method URL, and we're going to create our URL from a string, like this. So we just use string and then a colon, and then we're going to put in our string here. And we'll use the good old stackoverflow.com. If you've been debugging your work so far, you've almost certainly come across this site. And this would create by default an optional, because there's a chance if we've mistyped the URL, for example, if we just type that as our string, then this would fail and it wouldn't generate a correct URL. However, we're certain that our URL is correct because we've just typed it in there. So I'm going to force unwrap that, but you could, if you wanted, put an if let URL in there and then put everything else inside that if statement. That would work too. Either way around, but I'll go back to force unwrapping. Then we take our web view and we're going to load a request. And that URL request we create using the method URL request. And we create a URL request usually from a URL. And the URL that we're going to use is the URL that we defined on the previous line. Close that second bracket. And that's it. So let's take a look. So all we've done there is we've created a URL from a string, and then we've taken our web view and we've loaded a URL request, which we took from the URL itself. And there we go. Here's the Stack Overflow site in the web view, and you can see we can scroll on it and tap on links just as we would any other mobile website. So this can be a very useful way of displaying, say, a contact form within your app, or just getting some information to the user that's stored on a web page somewhere. But what if you've got some web content that's stored within your app and you want to display that on the web view? Well, that's also very easy to do. We just use a different command. Instead of load request, we use load HTML string. So HTML, if you haven't studied it before, is the language of websites. And it looks a little bit like this. That's a very, very simple bit of HTML with a header or h1 tag and then some text, and then we close the tag using the slash symbol there. So the HTML itself doesn't really matter, but we're going to load this string into the web view. The base URL is optional, and I'm just going to put nil there. That's for if you have any links within your HTML page which are relative links, so they're within a page, then the base URL will be where those links are considered relative to. But I suspect you're unlikely to need that. Incidentally, this method is the basis of systems such as PhoneGap, which allow you to build relatively complete apps in HTML and JavaScript. And there we go. You can see the h1 or header hello there content right there in our web view. So particularly if you're a web developer, web views can be a very useful way of displaying either information stored on the web or HTML itself that you've got either downloaded or stored in your app somewhere. More usefully though, we can also use our apps to download the actual code of a web page and then process it and do what we like with it. And that's what we're going to do to build our What's the Weather app in a couple of videos time. Doing that is a lot more powerful than just displaying a website, but it's also a little bit more complicated. So let's work our way through. I'm going to comment out the web view parts of the code because we won't be using a web view for this. But we will create a URL in just the same way. So URL with a string, and we'll stick with good old Stack Overflow.com. Next, we're going to define a variable called request, which is going to be an NS mutable URL request. And this just allows us to create a request for a particular URL, really just like we did here. There. So then we add in our URL. And this time, just to show you a different way to do it, I'll use the if let method. And that just allows us to avoid any exclamation marks, any forced unwrapping. So if, as may be the case, as I've got an error there in my URL, my app wouldn't actually crash. It would just not process the URL. Okay, so now we've got our request, we're going to create a task. And this is essentially the process of going onto the web, grabbing the content of the URL and returning it. So this task is going to be a URL session, and it's going to be the shared URL session. So this is essentially the general URL session on the phone that we can go on and use to access our data. You could imagine it a little bit like opening up a browser window and getting the content of a website. And then within that URL session, we're going to do a data task. And this is going to be a data task with URL request. And the URL request is the request that we created earlier. But we do just need to cast that to a particular type, a URL request. Okay. Now this URL request will return up to 3 variables. The first is data, or I'm going to call it data at least, which is where the data from the URL will be stored. there'll be a response, which will be whether or not the process was successful, and there'll be, or hopefully not at least, an error message. So these are the three variables that we can use in our code below to process the data and work out whether or not the task was successful. And then we use the keyword in, just in, which essentially says we're going to be using these three variables in the following code. Okay, so first off, I would normally check to see if the error is not nil. So if the error is not nil, that means we've got some sort of a problem. So for now, I'll print it to the logs. In a real app, you would probably want to display some sort of error to the user there. Else, here we haven't got an error, but we don't know for sure yet whether we've got some data. So I'm going to do an if let, and we'll have a variable that I'll call unwrapped data. So if that's the case, then we know that we can use the variable unwrapped data, but we can't quite just print it to the logs. We need to convert it. So I'll use a data string. And this is going to be an NS string. And it's going to be an NS string created from data. There we go. So we'll use that one. So the data that we're going to use is unwrapped data. And the encoding, the standard encoding that this URL will be returned in is UTF-8. You can Google that if you want to find out more about different encoding for websites and text in general. But we're just going to define that here, and we do that using string.encoding.utf8.raw value. And essentially that returns the raw value associated with this type of encoding so that the NS string method knows what type of encoding we want. Okay, and then for now, we'll just print data string to the console. And before we run that, the bit that I always forget is to actually run the task. And you do that with the slightly strange instruction task.resume. So if you miss out that line, it won't do anything because all we're doing here is defining the task, and here we're running the task. Even though we're using the keyword resume, we're effectively just running the task for the first time. So to run through that very quickly again, we're checking to see if this URL can be created from this string. And if it can, we're creating a request from that URL. That will always be successful as long as the URL is valid. And then we're creating a task, which is a URL session, which is a bit like opening up a browser window to get some website content. We're doing that with the request that we created up here. Then we're looking for these three variables, even though we only actually care about the first and the third, in this code down here. And then we're checking to see if there's an error. If there is, we're displaying the error. If there isn't, then we're checking to see if we can get the data variable, and if we can, we're converting it to a string from the UTF-8 encoding and then printing that string. Now we've got an interesting error message here, which gives me the opportunity to show you something I was going to show you at the end of the video, but I can show you now. So in Xcode 7 and iOS 9, something called the App Transport Security Policy was introduced, which essentially blocks all unsecure URLs. So this error that we're getting here is saying that we can't load http://stackoverflow.com because it's insecure. That's an interesting error because we are not trying to load that URL. We're trying to load HTTPS, which is secure. So what do we do if we want to load an insecure URL? Or indeed, if we get this ATP error when we're trying to load a secure URL? Well, we jump over to a file that we haven't investigated yet called info.plist. We'll be coming back to this file a few times in the rest of the course. And essentially, it's a store of bits of information about our app. So things like version numbers, required device capabilities, supported interface orientations, etc., etc. So in order to allow a domain to be loaded over HTTP and not HTTPS, we're going to add a row. So I just control-clicked there and then add row. And the row that we're going to add is NS app transport security. And then we'll open that up and tap the plus button. And now we've got two options here. We've got allow arbitrary loads. Now, if you change that to yes, then that will enable your app to load any domain over HTTP. This is generally not a great idea though, as it does leave your app potentially open to insecurities, and it's possible your app will be rejected from the App Store unless it has a very good reason to do this. If, for example, you were implementing a web browser, then you would need this. But if you're just loading from a particular domain, then much better to keep arbitrary loads at no, and then add in exception domains for the domains that you need. So let's open that up and then add a new item, and this is where you put the domain name. So in this case we'll have stackoverflow.com, and then we're going to set the type of the entry for stackoverflow.com to a dictionary and add an item to that dictionary. Whoops, just the one. And the item that we're going to add is NS temporary exception allows insecure HTTP loads. Make sure you get that exactly right with capital letters and everything. And that's going to be a Boolean with a value of yes or true. Okay, so now we've added an entry for stackoverflow.com in exception domains with an NS temporary exception allows insecure HTTP loads to be true. And there's one more option that we need to add, and that is to just specify that we want to include subdomains. And we do that using NS includes subdomains. And we're going to set that to be a Boolean. And that's going to be true as well. So a subdomain is something like, if you've got stackoverflow.com, a subdomain would be www.stackoverflow.com. And here we do want to use a subdomain, so I'm going to select true from there. Another option would be to specify in the domain name www.stackoverflow, and then you wouldn't need to include the subdomains. So if you'd rather do it that way, that's fine too. Now let's have a look and see if that fixes our problem. As I say, this could be a beta bug here because we're not trying to access an HTTP domain. But either way, it's definitely good to know about how to allow insecure domains if you need to. And here we go. So you can now see that we've got a big chunk of HTML, which is the content of stackoverflow.com. Excellent. So just one more thing to show you before we move on and see how we process this data. I did mention at the beginning of the video that we're working with queues here, and indeed we are. This task is going to happen at the same time as the code below it. So if, for example, I added a print command after the task, then this would happen before this code here. And this is called asynchronous or multi-threaded programming. And generally, it's great for things like getting content from URL, because then we can do things such as setting up the user interface or displaying a loading message for the user while we're waiting for the data to come back. The one complication is if we want to display this data on the screen or update the screen in any way after this data has come back, we need to, it's known as dispatch the queue. So if we had a label, for example, and we wanted to put this data into that label, and we just updated the label here, that would likely be extremely slow, and it would wait for the queue to close, which could take 10 to 20 seconds, or even longer. If we want it to happen straight away, then we use a command called dispatch queue. And the queue we want to dispatch is the main queue. And we essentially want to synchronize with that queue. So we want to say we're now ready to rejoin the main queue and do something on it. So this is where we would now update the user interface. So we're not actually going to do that here, but in a couple of videos time, when we build our weather app, we will need to use this. And if we don't, our code will still work, but it will take a very, very long time. As I say, up to around 30 seconds is not abnormal. All right, so whenever you need to get data from the web, come back and use some structure like this in your app. We're going to need to move away slightly from web content and learn how to work with strings to manipulate them and extract the content that we want from them. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next video.